During the Second World War, Nazi Germany made enemies of Europe and much of the world. But the regime had another lesser-known foe, the rising threat from a deadly disease. Dana Jacobson traveled to Philadelphia to speak with author Sam Apple, who uncovered a fascinating connection between the Nazis, a Jewish scientist, and a breakthrough cancer research that's still being studied today.
Cancer had really become a German obsession by the 1920s. It was almost a panic, and I think that's in large part because the disease had become so much more common.
By the 1930s, cancer was the second leading cause of death in Germany, and a grave concern for the country's ruling party, the Nazis.
Nobody understood why it was happening. I mean, to this day, we don't fully understand. I mean, that's a lot of what my book is about.
That book by author Sam Apple is titled Ravenous: Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection.
Take me back then and introduce me to Otto Warburg. Who was he?
Sure. Otto Warburg was a brilliant German scientist. He was born in the late 19th century, and his father was a famous Jewish physicist, Emil Warburg. Einstein and Max Planck and Fritz Haber and Emil Fischer, all these world-famous scientists are in Warburg's house when he's growing up. And Warburg idolizes these men and decides that, he's going to be a great scientist too.
And that's what Warburg did. In 1931, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for his research on cellular respiration. His discovery that cancer cells take up nutrients and eat in a different way from other cells became known as the Warburg effect.
Technically, what the Warburg effect is that it was understood that a human cell could turn to fermentation, but it was thought that's something that a cell only does in desperation. That's something that a cell does when it doesn't have oxygen. And actually, if you exercise really intensely and you start breathing, your lungs are heaving, you don't have enough oxygen to sort of run respiration, so your cells do turn to fermentation. But the Warburg effect is really, he discovered that cancer cells were doing this even though, there was oxygen available.
Warburg continued his research as the Nazis strengthened their grip on Germany. He refused to leave his homeland, even though he was Jewish and gay, living openly with his male partner.
He said, I was here before Hitler. Who's going to tell me to get out of my institute? He had this gorgeous institute that had built for him 2 years earlier, but it's built with money from the Rockefeller Foundation. And he said that they can't touch me.
As others attempted to appease the Nazis, Warburg provoked them.
So these Nazi brown shirts would come to his institute and harass him. And at one point he said, I'm going to burn down my institute if you come here again. How dare you show up here? You refuse to give the Nazi salute. You refuse to put up the Nazi flags that all the other institutes were doing.
How did he survive and not get sent to a concentration camp as other Jews or homosexuals would have been?
Yeah, and so it really comes to a head in 1941. He knows he stayed too long. He knows he should have left. And they call him into Hitler's chancellery. This is like truly the belly of the beast. They tell him, we're going to let you live, but you're going to focus on cancer.
Apple says the timing of the meeting shows just how serious the Nazis were in their offensive on the disease.
It was hours before Operation Barbarossa started. This was the biggest moment in the Nazi project. They were going to invade the Soviet Union in hours, and this is what they're talking about, hours before cancer research in Warburg.
In his own research, Apple uncovered another surprise. Hitler's obsession with cancer was personal.
Historians say that his mother was the only person he loved, the only person he had a relationship with, and she died of breast cancer.
How did that manifest itself later on with the Nazi Party?
Cancer was one more impurity, and the Jews were one more impurity for Hitler and the Nazis. So in a way, it fits into this dark sort of outlook that they had.
Was that hard when you're writing about that to wrap your head around some of it?
Yeah, it was very hard. Like most Jews, I lost family members in the Holocaust, and anytime you're researching these things, it's difficult. But it also deeply uncomfortable I'm so repulsed by the Nazis to the core of my being to say that they made any sort of progress in cancer.
You hate saying it.
I hate saying that.
6 million Jews were persecuted and murdered by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. Warburg would survive the war, leaving many in the scientific community to wonder how.
Before the war, it had been a major ideas about cancer that it involves this metabolic shift. And then after the war, I'd say in the 1950s, it's still around, but it starts to to sort of fade away. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but one of the kind of shocking ones is that people suspected Warburg for having stayed in Nazi Germany. How did this guy survive? Did he collaborate?
By the mid-70s, Warburg's metabolic approach was all but forgotten as scientists discovered cancer-causing genes, or oncogenes.
So everyone was now focusing on the oncogenes and what do they do. And it's taken us a long time to figure out what they do. Now that we know what they do, is they pretty much alter metabolism. And so
Which brings you back to Otto Warburg.
Brings back to Otto Warburg, right.
Dr. Lewis Cantley is the director of the Meyer Cancer Center at Weill Cornell. He discovered a previously unknown enzyme, PI3K.
We're heading into the tissue culture room. So these are the incubators where we grow the cancer cells.
Sam Apple approached Dr. Cantley while researching his book to ask a critical question. Could our diets be causing cancer?
I think sugar is the most dangerous food we eat. So when you consume fructose and it gets to the liver, gives you fatty liver, you become insulin resistant. And that means ambient insulin levels are high all the time. My lab discovered that insulin activates this enzyme PI3K, and the gene for that is one of the most frequently mutated genes in cancer, and it's activated by insulin. So if you're insulin resistant and you pick up one of these mutations, you have a very good chance that that's going to drive the growth of that tumor.
Author Sam Apple found that Dr. Cantley is just one of a number of scientists concerned about sugar and cancer.
My goal in writing my book, Ravenous, was really to see if there's a way to connect these stories, to put Warburg into the perspective of the whole diet story. My research and talking to many cancer scientists really came down to sugar in a very fundamental way.
Modern theories built on more than a century of science.
There's actually been this tremendous metabolism revival. It started in the late 1990s, and now they have conferences and new metabolism centers are opening, and it's really fundamentally changed cancer science. So, Warburg was lost, and now he's been rediscovered.
A book I did not know about beforehand, but we'll check out now. Sounds fascinating. Thank you, Dana.
Remarkable legacy, too, to think about all of the conflict he must have felt, working on this, but at the same time knowing he was working on the project he wanted to advance the science.
And advancing it. And we're still talking about it today. So glad we rediscovered this lost history.
For sure.